Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois. And we have got a great show for you today. We are talking about soil contaminations and kind of dealing with that. What does that mean? And the research that goes into that here at U of I Extension. We're going to be talking with Zack Grant here in just a second. But you know, I'm not doing this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. How are you?
I am doing fantastically speaking. How about yourself?
Not bad. Can't complain.
No complaints here. Exactly. Have you tasted your soil lately?
I have not. I don't know if I want to taste my soil.
You have a dog. I have two dogs, so this is probably a really bad idea. Maybe one day we'll do a show about pets in the landscape because they just destroy everything. But yeah, but how would you say your soil is in your home, your property?
I think it's pretty good. We got nice black soil. We do live behind a historic house, the Duncan Mansion in Jacksonville, which used to be Governor Duncan's house. And I think we may have been part of their trash pit because every time we dig, we get china and random pieces of stuff in the yard. So it's like being an archaeologist every time you dig a hole sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would say, yeah, because your house itself where you live is also an older home. So whatever construction disturbance that occurred there happened decades, if not 100 years ago. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the house was 1920s when it was built. Depending on who you talk to, we get different dates. So I'm not entirely sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, old, yeah, and leaky is that I've heard people often describe houses of that age. So, yeah.
We get some nice drafts. The curtains flutter sometimes when it's nice and windy and cold out and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I would classify my home as more of a conventional suburbia type home built mid 70s. You can definitely, when I'm digging outside and planting things either near the house, and then as I move away from the house, there's definitely a gradient of soil texture differences. I mean, near the house, it's just a mishmash of stuff. From like, I'll put the shovel in the ground and it'll go right in. I'll put the shovel in the ground right next to it. It'll be like hard clay. A little bit farther, there's a rock or concrete. And so that's up against the house. You get farther away, it gets a little bit better. So, but yeah, here in Illinois, we do have nice deep soil, at least here in central Illinois. So I guess we're lucky enough for that.
Yes. Looks like chocolate cake.
That's right. Yes. Well, I think it is time to introduce our special guest because his soils might be a little bit different where he's growing. I don't know, though, so we better talk about it. So let's introduce local food, small farms educator Zack Grant in South Suburban Cook County. Zack, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ken, Chris, for having me. Longtime listener, first time caller, first time guest. This is great. Super excited.
I'm glad you broke through our outer circle to make it onto this illustrious podcast. You broke through. Way to go. By breakthrough, we had a conversation last week at a conference. So, yeah. But no, Zack, I mean, honestly, I've been a fan of yours for a while, watching the stuff that you do. So, I mean, how would you classify the soil that you grow in? Because you're located in Cook County. Do you have the soil like Ken and I have, like chocolate cake?
It depends. And that was a really great intro you all did, because I think we can refer back to it as we get into this conversation. So where I'm at, and you can actually see I have a little background of SoSuCo, the South Suburban Cook County Extension Research Urban Ag Demonstration Farm. We just call it SoSuCo for short. I'm always trying to find an acronym for everything, right? So think Tribeca or those neighborhoods in New York that have those really catchy acronyms. It always seems like when you see big grants that the university puts together, they also come up with really excellent acronyms for the grants. So I was trying to find one, and SoSuCo was kind of the best possible one that I could come up with. So we are located in more suburban, rural fringe, kind of para-urban Cook County. So this site actually has kind of a mixture of what I call native soil types that were developed through normal kind of soil formation processes over millennia, right? And potentially influenced by agriculture, but we can kind of get into that. Kind of versus what I think you're getting at, which is the more properly termed anthropogenic or technosol type soils, which are heavily influenced soils, which when we talk about urban areas, that pretty much is what they're classified as. We can, if you've ever looked at the NRCS soil map, the digital soil map, the physical soil maps, the soil orders, there's always some sort of classification, whether it's a Flanagan silt loam or something very specific. But up here in Cook, it's really a black box. In fact, if you look at the NRCS, they have not only the digital soil map, but they actually have posters that you can purchase. And there's a couple of really great posters. I have a couple of them looking at the soil orders for all of Illinois. And most of the soils, as Ken referred, these black chocolate cake soils are in that sort of mollisol prairie soil or the forest type soils. Which have thinner topsoils, but are still, pretty rich, well-defined topsoils. But if you look at Cook County, primarily, and especially the city of Chicago, it's completely grayed out. They don't have any sort of proper soil order classification for really anything. In Chicago, there's a little bit in kind of the suburban areas of Cook County, and in particular, SoSuCo behind me, they actually still have some classified soil. So we have two different, I think, an Elliott silt clay loam and one other type of kind of silty clay loam. So most of our demonstration farm actually does have native soils that are classified, but we treat part of the demonstration area, and I can show an image here in a moment, like we would a proper urban soil that doesn't really have classification. So before we get into the contamination, just in general, that's kind of, urban soils are generally unclassified, which is interesting because there likely are some spots, right? Like when I look at the soil map, the NRCS soil map, if you look at like Humboldt Park or Garfield Park, right, which have been green spaces since the beginning of Chicago's formation, some of those park soils actually have classification because they're undisturbed, never been touched. But the rest of the developed part of urban areas, like they just don't go out and take the soil cores and do the, whatever they do, the soil mappers, however they develop those soil maps, they just haven't done it in the urban areas. But I've actually heard whispers that the NRCS is interested in maybe taking a second look at that, maybe to seeing if there are some actual classifiable soils in urban areas, even though by and large we kind of treat it as unclassifiable, non-native soils, essentially.
That's interesting. Yeah. So like when the NRCS sent out their surveyors across the country, Chicago probably was not a priority for them. But I have heard, one soil scientist, he's joined our ranks as a volunteer recently. He was one of them in the 70s and 80s in Iowa that helped classify those soils. And we've actually recently had NRCS does update those soil maps. And so, as you mentioned, there is a new push to update some of these to make them a bit more applicable to urban farming. So we didn't touch on that yet, what SoSuCo does and what it grows, and maybe your background in that urban agriculture. Could you just maybe touch on that just a little bit? Like what's urban agriculture and what are you growing at SoSuCo?
Sure. So, I mean, a little bit, my background, I don't come from a farming background, but I've been involved in what I kind of call small scale, diversified, like intensive vegetable farming, year-round vegetable farming with high tunnels even, for about almost 25 years now, as crazy as that is to say for me. And I used to manage the student farm project on campus, on U of I's main campus. Maybe some of your listeners have heard of that. I used to manage that. So I was kind of doing this sort of what I would call medium to slightly large compared to urban agriculture, diversified vegetable production at that site. That was like a 7-acre, pretty intensively mechanized kind of vegetable operation. But I always had a passion for like the sort of micro farming scale, what the Europeans call market gardening, what we call here market farming in a lot of sense. There's some discrepancy over the European definition and the US definition between what's a garden versus what's a farm in terms of direct marketing specialty crops. So that kind of led me down this path of interest in urban agriculture. I kind of come from the Chicagoland area, although I didn't grow up in Chicago proper. I grew up just south of the city. So I just had an interest in it, and this extension position opened up to kind of focus on urban agriculture a little bit more within our local food small farm team. So I just jumped on it. And in terms of definition, I mean, there really isn't a proper like specific definition. I mean, in general, urban agriculture is more or less the growing of specialty crops in urban settings at a variety of different scales or typologies, as I like to refer to it sometimes. So urban ag can refer to, really even backyard kind of urban home food production or urban homesteading, all the way up to, multiple acre market farms in urban settings. But in general, most of the farms we see are kind of in the several thousand square feet up to half acre to acre, couple acres in size. SoSuCo behind me is about 10,000 square feet. And just for visual purposes, I'll share my screen and show you an overhead shot of what that looks like. So that's kind of what it looks like above. This is a drone shot. We did this really cool 3D mapping. I won't go into it today, but essentially all those arrows you see, you'll be able to click on those, and it turns it in, like Street View in Google Maps, how you kind of go on the Street View. All those arrows will be street views essentially of the farm, and you can kind of navigate around our demo farm. So here you can see this is about 10,000 square feet inside of the fence. In total, we have maybe closer to like 5,000 to 6,000 square feet of bed space. We have a high tunnel, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, a little storage container, a little seasonal wash pack up there. So most of the outdoor areas that you see at the bottom, those are all kind of native soils that we manage kind of like a traditional market farming system. And then in the upper right-hand corner, where you see those raised beds, and there's 3 beds just south of that we call berm bed systems, which we can talk about a little bit later. And there we have the native soil capped. So our soil isn't contaminated, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we sort of treat it like it is contaminated, and to kind of mimic and mirror and demonstrate what a lot of these urban farm practitioners have to do, where they can't use the soil. They essentially just use landscape fabric, like you can kind of see in the path there, put maybe a layer of wood chips down, and then build beds, structured or unstructured beds, berm beds on top of that with soil and compost. So we grow a diversity of crops, anywhere from, just like cooking greens. In this image, you can see things like kale and collards, a lot of the fruiting crops in the southwest corner there. That's a lot of just the cucurbit and solanaceous family fruiting crops. In the high tunnel, we primarily do fruity and vegetables. We're actually going to do some of the ginger trial work with you all this year in that tunnel, as well as winter salad greens. So very similar crops to rural market farms. Kind of the scale and size and scope are just a little bit smaller and a little bit more intensively focused. So, I mean, in the tunnel, for instance, typically we'll grow anywhere from 3 to 4 different crops per bed in a year. Outdoors, we sometimes get to 2, maybe 3 crops. So a lot of double, triple cropping, which is a hallmark of a lot of urban ag systems.
So is this a drone image? And then you have, within that, you now have kind of linked to a 3D camera that's on the ground. So aerial drone, and now then there's buttons you can push, linking the 3D imagery of the farm on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay.
It was a project we did this past summer with Ohio State University. I'm a part of this urban ag integrated pest management working group, and it was just a project that we worked on. And it's really cool. Some Cornell folks did this several years ago, and then there was a IPM professor at Ohio State University that did this with a bunch of Ohio urban farms a couple years ago. And I just love the concept so much, not only, for our teaching and kind of demonstration purposes, but just, but mainly to connect people, via Zoom or things like this with, urban farm tours, so they don't have to physically go in. I can just zoom in on one. Let's just click on one of the arrows really quick. So there, it just went from that overhead image. So now you're kind of looking down this area right here where we had, one bed of kale and, a bunch of tomatoes and peppers outdoor. We're doing a little bit of unreplicated trial work with different organic fertility treatments outside. we're actually kind of starting to limit what we do at SoSuCo. So rather than trying to grow like 35 different crops that a lot of urban farms and community gardens try to do, we try to do our farm a little bit more like it's kind of a commercial urban farm. So we're going to start focusing on like the higher value cash crops. And that's going to be easier for us to do replicated work. So, if we're just looking at one crop to track like yield or productivity, it'll be easier to assign different, fertility treatments or, mulching regimes or whatever we want to do, irrigation regimes, so we can actually get some good replicated data versus just like doing observational side-by-side comparison. So we do a little bit of it all here in our own replicated work, just traditional extension demonstration stuff. We donate everything from this site too, like all of us in extension who are involved with donation garden projects. I think we did about 4,000 pounds of produce from this site last year. So we've averaged around that for the past few years. We donate it all to a couple food pantry locations in South Suburban Cook. So yeah, that's a little gist of the site. We use it also for training was the last thing I'll mention about this particular site, our Master Urban Farmer Training Program. We use this, for a lot of the content for the course, but also we have some workshops here with the students who take that kind of hybrid online training with us as well. Yeah,
they can get some like physical, like hands-on demonstration work here. So yeah, exactly. Very cool. Exactly. Yeah, SoSuCo. Hey, I've never been there, and maybe I can go visit virtually. So very neat to have this tool. And here's another picture just inside the high tunnel, so you can kind of see what that looks like. And here we actually have we started building some structured raised beds. These are 6-inch raised beds built with cedar 5/4 or essentially 1-inch decking boards. It's a little bit cheaper to do it that way versus like the 2x dimensional cedar lumber, which is more rot resistant. We would grow in ground here. Again, this soil isn't contaminated, but we're actually replicating a little bit of what they do at the Dixon Springs Ag Research Center in Southern Illinois. It just makes it easier to do like different replicated work. And it's definitely easier to like transition like from the crops you see in this image to winter crops. Because if you can imagine like pulling all this out and trying to get the beds ready for winter crop planting in September, it can be a real challenge. So that was one of the issues with that. So yeah, we once this is available to the public, we'll get the link out so people can come, see what we're actually talking about here in this podcast interview. Yeah, and are you still pretty active on the Local Foods YouTube channel? Do you still post updates? I try to. So much like yourself, Chris, who kind of experimented into the sort of vlog space in on YouTube. I've got this vlog series I call the Urban Ag Connect vlog series. It kind of corresponds with our Urban Ag Connect newsletter we put out quarterly up here in Cook. And, I've got maybe like 30 or so video vlogs on there. And as you both know well, with the kind of post recording edit process, like it is fun to do. I like doing it, just like you guys love doing this, but it was taking a little bit more time than I anticipated. So I'll probably continue to do it in some format, but what I'm actually trying to do this year, which I'll definitely get you the links for to push this out, is I have an Instagram channel for SoSuCo. So I want to start doing more of their like video reels and just, images I post and talk about there, because a lot of farmers, small farmers, and I'm sure a lot of gardeners, they tend to gravitate towards Instagram, it feels like, for the visual aspect of it. So I don't know if you all are into Instagram at all for anything you do extension wise, but I'm going to try to start doing more of that this year. So in that way, it's just easier for me to do while I'm there. If there's an idea, I can make a quick little, 2-minute video, post it on Instagram and share it while I'm there versus like going back into the office, editing, posting, trying to promote it, blah, blah, blah. Oh, cool. Yeah. And we'll put those in the show notes. I'll say Ken and I are working on our dance coordination so we can become TikTok stars. But in seriousness, what was the statistic I heard? The majority of people under age 25 are using TikTok as their news source. So instead of going to Google and typing in, urban farming, they're going to TikTok and they're typing that in. So it's another Just another platform for us to get on, Ken.
It is. It's challenging in extension because we do our best as educators to, either do some of the research ourselves or work with faculty members or try to mine that literature for that good data to share. And it's so hard for us to share that good information. Whereas in what I call the popular media in gardening and horticulture, like, there's countless examples on YouTube and Instagram. People have millions of followers and their followers just listen to everything they say, even if it's not really well validated, growing information. Not to say they're not good growers and it's not good material and education to share, but it's just maybe not as rigorous in terms of the sort of work that we try to do in extension. So perennial challenge for us.
It's forever. Yeah, that's job security, right, Ken?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's TikTok our way over to talk about soil contamination. Ken, could you get us started in this line of questioning, please?
Yes, I think we've touched on this a little bit. But how do urban soils kind of differ from our quote unquote normal soils? You talked about, don't necessarily have soil classifications for urban soils, but are there other ways that we could kind of differentiate them from our maybe less more undisturbed type soils?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned that terminology, that anthropogenic technosoil. There is actually a whole kind of soil science involved in anthropogenic soils. But in general, it really is highly disturbed soils, right? So if you think about a traditional soil profile where you have the A horizon, B horizon, C horizons, and like the regolith or the actual material maybe that the soil was formed from. In urban soils, it tends to be situations where you might dig down a foot and it might kind of look like a rural soil, but you might dig down 6 inches and there's a bunch of like rubble or fill from a building that was there or material that was scraped from one location and deposited there. You don't know what you're going to get. It's a bit of a grab bag in terms of the actual soil profile. So to our, kind of adding on to what we were talking about earlier, interested, I'm actually looking at a paper right now. I don't know that I need to share an image of this. And they actually were looking at, and this is something I thought was intriguing, some of the initial classified anthropogenic soils, you can probably imagine they were looking at in Italy, in Rome, right, where they were kind of excavating ruins. They would actually dig out and they'd find like, Roman walls or fences that they would build or old floors, or even situations where they would find like kind of like what they're calling it, vegetable mold, in quote, or like vermicompost or dark earth that they had deposited for growing on top of what they found was like the actual native soil, before the Roman times. So I think all that to say, maybe, you mentioned earlier, Chris, talking about both of your sites where you're just kind of digging down. That's something that I would recommend everyone, whether you're in an urban area or wherever you're at. You can look at these soil maps, right? But I think the first thing you got to do is get out there and just dig down and see what you're working with, right? You maybe don't have to dig a full soil pit like some soil scientists do, but you certainly want to dig down and see what you're working with, right? And you're going to get some idea right away whether or not you have kind of an urban, heavily transformed anthropogenic soil or something that's kind of native and was there in the first place. So I bring that up again, Ken, with your question, only to say that assessment of your site or your soil, definitely if you're in an urban area, is important, but even maybe some of the suburban kind of rural fringe areas, especially in your case, Ken, where you said you have an old house really close by, right? So if you're thinking about doing any food production gardening in and around like, a century-old house, lead contamination might be the big priority. So you maybe even want to dig down and see what's going on, but then also kind of cordon that area off for a separate, what we'd call a composite soil sample, because that area might be high risk, right? And then maybe in an area where, especially maybe in a rural setting where there wasn't an old house, maybe that can be kind of your low risk sample. So I think a mixture of the actual physical structure of these soils and the profile it definitely differentiates and is something you need to start with, because even if you find out that your soil isn't contaminated, it may be primarily rubble, or it may be super compacted, or there may be an old parking lot, a few inches down. So you really need to figure those things out first before you really worry about contamination. But then, yeah, I would say that the thing that sets urban soils aside from rural soils is the higher risk of contamination. And, one thing I've learned, I'm not a environmental engineer or proper EPA environmental assessment expert, but there are some basic things you can do in terms of assessing your site. I mean, if you know that a neighborhood or your site was primarily residential and there was no industry, or it's maybe not next to like a super heavily trafficked road, then the primary potential contaminant would still be heavy metals and primarily lead, right? Because for the old house example, most of the paint up until the 70s was lead-based paint, and pretty much all the gasoline up until that same era was lead-based gasoline. So high traffic lead deposition is a problem, and lead paint is a big problem. So old homes, proximity to high traffic areas, lead's going to be your big number one factor, and that gets most of the attention when it comes to environmental contamination in urban soil. Certainly, there's other things like the other polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and there's a new thing with biosolids now. Well, it's not a new thing, but a new interest, the PFAS compounds like per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the forever chemicals. There's all sorts of stuff popping up all the time that you might have to be concerned about, depending on how the site was used. But I would say heavy metals probably gets the most attention, and lead, which we've done some research with campus faculty, and the work has been done elsewhere too, has been the primary focus.
What about, say, like arsenic or something like that, maybe in more rural areas?
So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So the one heavy metal contaminant, at least that I know of in looking into this, is if you are in a rural area and you had maybe like a very old orchard that was managed maybe with very old, now outdated, unlabeled pesticides, arsenic was a common active or maybe, inner ingredient in those pesticides. And so if you know that you have an area like that where arsenic was used as a pesticide, you might want to do some heavy metal testing for arsenic. So that's a great example of doing what the EPA calls that phase 1 risk assessment, where you're just kind of figuring out what happened with that soil or that area before your new intended use of growing food in it. And, sometimes that might be easy to figure out. You might have neighbors who know, like, oh yeah, that was an old orchard. They used to spray all sorts of crazy stuff. So that might be a clue, like, okay, yeah, we should probably test for arsenic. But if you're in an urban area, it's like, oh yeah, if it's just an old neighborhood with old historic housing stock, then maybe lead's the big concern. But I'm actually working with a group. I was just doing a technical assistance with a MEFTP participant, and they're building an urban farm site right next to an old EPA Superfund site and across from another brownfield. So it's not on that site, but it's adjacent to it. So in that case, that opens up a whole other can of worms. Like, lead could be a problem, but there could be all sorts of other potential environmental contaminants that you don't know about. And even if you can test for some of those things, for some of those contaminants, there's not always like a really good one-to-one, oh, we know it's here at this level, here's what you do about it, right? We're starting to learn more with lead, which we can discuss here as we move along, but it's not always straightforward in terms of what we do with remediation. But we have some tactics that we can talk about that work, and that definitely work really well for urban ag because of the small scale footprint. We can do a lot more what we call in situ remediation versus like anything having to do with like removing soil, cleaning it, bringing it back, which there are examples of people doing that. Like some of these EPA Superfund sites, that a very expensive ex situ remediation is to literally clean the soil, which I can't imagine the cost or all the heavy equipment you need to do something like that. But certainly, for rural areas, heavy metal contamination isn't as big of a concern unless, like you said, Ken, there might be a historic like pesticide usage in an area that you know about.
So how do you clean a soil? I'm assuming it's not like you just don't put it in the dishwasher, do you?
Yeah, that's
gone.
I don't
It cleans everything.
I'm not fully up to speed on it. When I look in the literature and the research on this, they talk about all these ex situ and in situ methods. So in situ is like in place there, not removing it. Ex situ is removing it. And when they talk about ex situ, they talk literally about like washing the soil, different things they can do after removing the soil and then bringing it back, which I'm not, that's kind of beyond my expertise or anything I'd be familiar with. But in situ for some of these metals, particularly lead, I think is a viable remediation strategy. And I kind of hinted at it earlier when I was describing some of our demo growing areas at SoSuCo, where you can literally, some people call it capping and filling, where you just kind of cap off what might be contaminated and you fill in on top of that. So, I mean, obviously for big acreages, that's not practical. But if we're talking about, a few thousand square feet, couple acres, that's probably more doable.
Well, in Macomb, they had a Superfund site in the middle of town that they cleaned up. And there was a pit 30 foot deep that they dug out.
Oh, wow.
And it was just kind of this empty pit for months. I don't know what they did with the soil. I don't know if they cleaned it or if they landfilled it or brought in fresh stuff. I don't know. All I know is it was maybe an acre big, probably less than that. And it was a huge project. Tons of equipment, tons of earth moving. It had to be pretty costly. And they filled it all back in. Now it's just a turf grass. So it's, yeah.
Well, one thing I will touch on before we get into any other more details about is in situ remediation or talking about lead in particular, is bioremediation. Because we get a lot of questions about that. And
we do.
It's one of those things where, this happens a lot when we're trying to do this knowledge translation from research, where it's like, there has been research done on it and shown that there are plants that are bioaccumulators of certain metals, right? But that doesn't always mean that there's a practical application for it. So on the subject of that, there certainly is plenty of research and data out there to show that certain plants can be bioaccumulators of some metals, not all in all contexts. But in order to truly remediate the soil to those geogenic or background levels, the time scale when they model this out it's just not practical. I mean, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years of constant bioremediation and uptake. And then even if you're doing that, you have uptake of a known environmental contaminant into biomass, and then that biomass needs to be disposed of properly. So while that sounds like it could be a promising strategy, in terms of practicality, it just doesn't seem like there's much water there in terms of application. I mean, certainly if there's like a Superfund site, like you're saying, Chris, and you wanted to put it into a forever perennial bioaccumulator, right? It's always, maybe that's an application for it. But if you're trying to grow food on a site and you're like, oh, my levels are maybe 100 part per million higher than what they need to be, let me try to reduce it with bioremediation, that it just doesn't seem like it's practical, unfortunately. And that also goes for, there's interest in like mycoremediation with mushrooms. It's kind of the same concept. Is certainly it does happen, right? You can replicate it in laboratory and maybe some field settings, but in terms of applicability, it really just isn't practical from what we can tell.
Let's bring in some of your research that you've done. Now, I remember, oh my gosh, how long ago was this? It was you and Dr. Andrew Margenot showed up to a team in service on campus, and you were talking about lead contamination, and you brought out this. This is like the second time we've referenced Star Trek in a month here on the show, but you brought out what I'll call a tricorder, and it's a portable X-ray. You know the words, I don't, Zach, but it astounded me. Let's tie in some of your research here now with some of the soil contamination. So what did your research entail, and was it looking specifically at lead? And what the heck is that tricorder thing?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it a little bit, and then I'll share one image, and this is also a link to one of our extension articles on the subject. So when Dr. Margenot came on campus several years ago, I was already maybe 3 years into my extension transition. he had some interest. He's a soil scientist by trade. He'd done a lot of really interesting work in Africa with soils, but he had an interest in, environmental contamination, particularly with lead. And I had never heard of, I knew about what I'll call wet chemistry for lead testing for traditional, and same thing with traditional soil testing we'll get into in a bit. But he brought up this idea of what he called let's use the term again, in situ, in place, dry chemistry involving the portable X-ray fluorescence device, or PXRF device. I mean, essentially, it's exactly what it is. It's a handheld scanning device that emits a low dose of radiation. Again, to handle the machine and operate it, you do need to get a little bit of training. I actually am not a certified operator of one. It was him and his lab students, his grad students, that were doing most of the actual scanning. But essentially, yeah, it's a portable machine, and you literally can in place scan any sample, right? Geologists use it quite a bit to look at chemical composition of different rocks, or even maybe anthropologists do it when they're excavating sites to try to figure out what the chemical makeup is of something in place without having to remove it. I think that's where the large application of that technology is. But Andrew had the idea, which wasn't a new idea, other people have been doing it, to apply it to soils. So essentially scanning the soil in place with an X-ray, and it gives you kind of a readout of the chemical makeup of that sample. The challenge with it, because it sounds nice, well, there's a few challenges. One is the handheld devices are anywhere from $8,000 to like $20,000 a piece. So it's not necessarily a piece of equipment that even an extension office could necessarily budget for. Certainly we would love to have one. I'm trying to get some of the NRCS offices up here to get one, and maybe there's going to be a new researcher at UIC who I've worked with who might get one in their startup package. Andrew has one on campus, and for that particular project, he partnered with Extension to. What we did is we had a bunch of different, either conferences or workshops or things where we had a bunch of people coming to an event, right? So we essentially just advertised it, bring in a sample, right? And come in, we'll scan it for you, give you the initial results. And I was there to kind of help them interpret that and tell them what that meant. So that was the primary kind of extension-facing citizen science interaction piece. But all that data kind of got molded into a couple research projects that him and his grad student worked on. And I'll just screen share just really quick. Here's the article that was published on our website that Emily Steele wrote a couple years ago now that kind of highlights most of it. And I think there's a link here to the open access research project for the lead map. And then Andrew and George Watson, his grad student at the time, further did a little bit of work in looking at lead uptake mechanisms with different types of, one particular crop in contaminated urban soil. So they looked at uptake into tomatoes, both in greenhouse studies and in-field studies in contaminated soils to see what the uptake mechanisms are. So, we collected maybe it was 200 to 300 samples with the extension events. And here's a picture of myself and I think it was Elizabeth was her name. That was Andrew's, I think, a research assistant at the time. You can literally see her pointing the gun. That's the PXRF device right there. So we'd had people coming in, scanning it live, but then his grad student actually went through, and this map that you see right here, this color coded map, his grad student went and did a kind of a cross-sectional survey of all the soils in Chicago. So he went into public any public easement that he could access from the sidewalk, or parkways, parks, and he just did this kind of gridded PXRF scan of the entire Chicagoland area. And this map right here, I think, is all the individual samples, but we worked with kind of a geospatial geography expert on campus to create a heat map. So somewhere in this, and we can share this with the listeners, there's a heat map where you can kind of look at your area of Chicago, and it kind of takes all these individual data points and creates a heat map. So you can see, oh yeah, I'm in this neighborhood, and it looks like the lead levels were a bit higher than they are in other areas. So it's not super granular and accurate, but at least it gives you an idea of oh yeah, maybe my neighborhood might have been a little more contaminated, so maybe I should look into this further before doing anything more extensive with that soil. So that was kind of the extension facing / research part of that particular project. And then then Andrew went on to do a little bit more work with the tomato uptake.
Sure. And the heat map, that's essentially, it takes those individual data points and creates gradients so that but yeah, I will say on this, at least the lead soil image here that they have of this data set of points, red is a high lead levels, green is low. The map has a lot of red and orange on it. Not as much green, I would say.
Definitely. The levels that we found with the study, this says average, but it was actually the median number, was around 220 part per million, which is 11 times higher than the geogenic levels of 20 part per million. So this is where it gets a little murky, though, because right below that, you're seeing they're saying that it's above the 400 part per million threshold that the EPA established a while back. But the problem with that 400 part per million level is that was established as a risk assessment for essentially children playing in and around contaminated soil. So that's really about breathing in dust or indirectly consuming soil with dirty hands.
Yeah.
It's not a level that was really hyper focused on, can I grow safely in that soil?
Yeah. So can I work that soil every single day? Like, can I be in it every day for a job? Yeah.
So that 400 part per million level is maybe more accurate for that. The California EPA, as California often does, they have slightly more stringent standards that are more akin to what European standards are for this a lot of times. And their cautious rate is slightly under 100 part per million or 80 part per million. So I've my new recommendation, just in general, based on our work and the work of others and other recommendations, is if you do a lead soil test, right? Whether it's PXRF or like a wet chemistry analysis that the lab does, there is some difference with that, which I didn't quite get into in terms of calibrating that PXRF machine. But in general, if it's less than 100 part per million or in that kind of 80 to 100 part per million range, you're probably okay. I mean, that's definitely above background levels, but in terms of like growing in it, working in it, it's likely okay. It's when you get above 100 part per million, and then the EPA 400 part per million is another threshold. It starts to get murky in terms of like the risk of that soil, right? With lead in particular. I've seen ranges all the way up to 1,200 part per million that Andrew and George looked at, where depending on what you're growing, that there might not be any uptake, right? So tomatoes are a good example. In this study in particular, they found that if soils were contaminated up to 1,200 part per million and they grew like a fruiting crop like tomatoes in them, there wasn't any detectable lead in that edible portion of the fruit. Now, maybe in a carrot crop in a 1,200 part per million soil, there might be a little bit more uptake, more accumulation, more risk in actually consuming those vegetables. So there's still a lot of gray kind of uncertainty with recommendations for growing and what your lead levels actually are. With some research like this, we're starting to refine it a little bit more. But again, back to what Ken's question earlier, it's all going to come back to what's the quality of my soil anyway, right? Does it drain well? Is it even actually a native soil? So even if it's not contaminated or kind of in that gray area of contamination, you might not want to grow in that soil anyway, right? Because of other factors. So capping it off, bringing in new soil, compost and topsoil mixtures, you might end up doing that anyway. So, and when you do that, you kind of negate growing in the soil and there's less concern about the levels of contamination in your soil, if that makes sense. And the last, well, not the last thing, but the one thing I do want to mention that is pretty clear with this work, as well as when you look at the literature, because when you're thinking about growing in contaminated soil, your first concern, and you were just kind of alluding to this, Chris, is, I'm growing in it. The plants are going to take the lead up. I'm going to eat the plant, and then I'm going to get the lead in me because of that. What I would call that is an indirect or secondary pathway for exposure. It certainly can happen. And there are groups, like especially young children, that are really sensitive to lead, for cognitive development, that it's really important to pay attention to that. But the primary concern pretty much for everybody is that direct lead exposure, to what you were saying, working in the soil all day, breathing in contaminated dust, not washing the produce and actually ingesting the soil itself. That is likely the bigger risk factor by far. And we've known this for a while, which is why that EPA 400 part per million threshold has been around for a while, because children living in old public housing stock that are exposed to, lead paint dust or contaminated soil in their playground, like they're getting exposed to lead that way, and it was causing cognitive issues with small children. So we've known that direct exposure was a big problem. So for growing in it, for farmers and gardeners, the one thing you can do to kind of knock that off as a best practice is just to not have any exposed soil, right? So we're putting down landscape fabric, we're putting down mulch. We're not working the soil too much when it's dusty and dry. So, or maybe we're even wearing masks, right? We talk about PPE with handling pesticides, but what about, breathing in dust and soil and those issues? We often overlook that. So, I think even wearing N95s if you're in a super dusty, potentially contaminated soil is probably a good idea. So it's little best practices like that in conjunction with testing your soil that kind of lead you down a path of like, what should I do if my soil is contaminated?
We'll link to this article that you shared with us, Zach, and it looks at lead. Is there another soil data set? Is there other contaminant data sets out there that people can see online, or have those not been developed?
Good question. This one is for lead. What I just showed you, that was just for lead. There may be, so there's the published work, and then there was a couple links in the article. I think there was the mapmyenvironment.com, I think that they'll find, where there may be other contaminants from other research where you can they have like GIS files like that to overlay it to show you maybe there's other contaminants. That's like an open source thing. It's welcome to Map My Environment, visualizing urban environmental health around the world. So yeah, you can actually view the map, or you can actually contribute like soil samples to it. And it's like an open source mapping project. So that just looking at that map, you might be able to find other things of interest, but certainly it doesn't have, every known possible contaminant and what the potential exposure levels are. Lead, again, back to our site assessment. Lead is very much tied to historic, use, right? Whether it's housing stock, automobiles. Well, Andrew in his lectures, he gives a great example of the Romans. We were just talking about the Romans. A lot of people know that story, right? Like the aqueducts, they're so innovative, but all their piping was made out of lead. So it was malleable. It was easy to make lead piping. And, they were inadvertently, poisoning themselves with lead, and they didn't know it. So it was like a good idea at the time, but in retrospect, it turned out that it wasn't such a great idea. So lead, we can really tie that to historical site use and maybe like the arsenic example with pesticides. But some of these other environmental contaminants with industrial use and brownfield sites and contamination like that, there's research, there's study, there's work done in that space, but it's not super clear. I have some checklists I've developed for urban farmers that want to develop a site, but it certainly is not exhaustive. You can't think about every possibility, which again ultimately leads us down to this in situ remediation, where we end up just kind of capping the soil potentially if we don't know for sure, and kind of bringing in a new media that we make, another type of technosol or anthrosol, but a beneficial one that we use to kind of grow in. So it's complicated. It's there's a lot of potential for urban agriculture. We're seeing it now. There's a lot of interest in it, but there certainly are significant upfront considerations you need to think about before just like starting to throw stuff in the ground and grow in it.
Well, that was a lot of great information about urban farming and dealing with soil contamination. We had a great conversation with Zach, and we are going to split this into two parts. So next week, look for part 2 as we continue this conversation with Zach about remediating contaminated soil kind of in a urban vegetable or farm situation. And some of the pitfalls that we run into, especially when it comes to soil management and all that compost we wind up throwing on the ground, which, some people say compost can do no wrong. And as you'll find out next week, it kind of can. So stay tuned for that. Check us out next week. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. And a special thank you to Ken Johnson and Zack Grant for hanging out and chatting with me about urban farming and soil contamination. And look for that conclusion next week. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.